This podcast episode is for every artist, activist, and culture worker who is looking at the state of the world that we live in and is freaking out, but is also feeling stuck about how, in the long run, they can have the impact that they truly desire. My fundamental belief is that unless you have wealth and unless you are well resourced, you will only be able to do so much as more wealth is taken from us and as more kind of world destabilizing events continue to happen and will progressively happen. Because without wealth, you cannot access the resources that you need to serve yourself and serve your community. My name is Philippa Ankler, and in today's episode of the Sovereign Creative Podcast, this one is going to be a little bit more money heavy. I'm going to be talking specifically about investing, specifically about the morality of owning shares and owning things in today's society. But I want to help unblock some of the challenges that people might have when it comes to finding not like necessarily a middle ground, but finding a way to move forward that still feels in line with your values, whilst also acknowledging the reality of the context that we live in, which is late stage capitalism. So hopefully by the end of this video, I will have convinced you that you are not only entitled to your wealth, but you need it. Especially for the hard times ahead, that you have a responsibility to protect your wealth and to increase it. And I'm going to be doing this over 3 points. Firstly, I'm going to be talking to you about the scale at which your investments are basically peanuts in comparison to multimillionaires. I want to help you reframe in your head what investments are actually doing for you. They're not a scheme to get rich quick. They're not a scheme to get rich off of the backs of exploiting others. And lastly, I need you to think about your intent and what you would do if you had the resources of people with hundreds of millions of pounds. So if you are interested in content like this, I am releasing these podcasts every Wednesday. I talk about money, creativity, all sorts. I talk about the importance of creativity, not only the life force that it is, but also the context in which it's actively being taken away from us. One of my most recent episodes was about my university actually deciding to make whole swathes of creative and cultural departments at the university redundant, despite the fact that the university is the most renowned across the UK for those specific courses. And that was more of a commentary video on the wider cultural trend of devaluing the arts on an institutional level to stop people from thinking critically and stop people from creating and commenting on the world that we live in a meaningful way. This one today is going to be a lot more about money, so let's get into it. So as I said, there's 3 points that I want us to kind of go over today. There's the scale, there's what investments are actually doing for you, and then there is your intent and the impact that you will have with that intent. So one of the things that I have also felt in the past when it comes to investing is the idea that if I start investing, that I am a bad person and that I'm just as bad as these billionaires, right? Or just as bad as these people that own hundreds of millions of pounds in unethical companies. I felt that way investing £10 a month, which is actual peanuts compared to what shareholders are doing with the millions of pounds that a lot of them were often born with, that were often put in trust funds, invested on their behalf before they were even burst into the world, or money that they have generated or taken from us by exploiting us in some shape or form. So with a lot of companies, that is through energy, it is through the housing market, it is through paying us shit wages and then charging us extortionate prices. And in other shape or form, it's developing some sort of business idea that's founded on a scam, really. These people aren't entrepreneurs and they're not actual businessmen, they're scam artists and they're con artists. And I think we need to kind of like decouple that distinction when it comes to entrepreneurship in business, that a lot of these companies are basically getting away with coercing us or exploiting us into purchasing their services, which otherwise should be available to us for free or shouldn't even be needed in the first place. So that's another point out the way, which we can discuss in another video. So for people like you and me who do not have the level of wealth of shareholders, chances are you don't even own your own home. You're probably renting, or if you do have a mortgage, you are basically, your home is being loaned to you from the bank and you are paying them back in installments. For people like you and me, the investing portfolio will look very different, okay? Rather than having hundreds of millions of pounds invested in these companies, typically the way that we recommend people start out if they're investing is to invest as little as like 10, 20, 50 pounds a month, and to put it in a fund of, say, the top 500 companies such as the S&P 500, or if you live in the UK list specifically is the FTSE 100, which are the 100 companies that are headquartered in the UK. So let's say you start investing £10 a month. So proportionally like that £10 a month is split across the list of funds within that company, like usually by percentage based on like the size of the company. So most of, say, the S&P 500, I'd say the majority of it, like I think it's like 12 or 15% is invested in the top 7 companies within that fund, which is Microsoft, Apple, Tesla, etc. But proportionally, just to kind of help you understand like the amount of money that you're investing to begin with, if you're putting £10 into 100 companies and hypothetically you put that £10 equally across all of the 100 companies, you're putting 10p into each company. If you're investing £10 into the S&P 500, you're putting 2p each into that company. So again, in comparison to billionaires, that's peanuts. So that's my first point. The second point that I want to go over is what the investments are actually doing for you versus what we think in our heads, or what, based on the impression of what the billionaires and the multimillionaires that are investing in scale are doing, is that what we are doing is the same thing as them. So I've also found this point around why we invest particularly like difficult to wrap my head around because of my own values, and I also didn't like that I had to do this and that I found it very uncomfortable to begin with, but that's because of this idea that I had in my head that investing is making you rich from the exploitation of others. So like that's not true. So in this video, I want to help you dissolve that. So again, chances are you understand the power of money and you don't like the way that elites are basically siphoning off billions of pounds of our taxes. You might also be a boycotter. You want to withhold your wealth, or you do withhold your wealth from companies that don't align with your values, and you want to change the way that you consume to better benefit independent businesses and actual working people, and not people who were born into life-changing wealth. And again, you might not fully own any of the things that you rely on to live, whether it's your house, whether it's the energy that switches the lights on in your house, whether it's the land that you live on or the house that you sleep on. So what I want to draw your attention to is when there are destabilizing global conflicts, such as the Iran war, or when the pandemic happened, or when supermarket prices skyrocketed because they increased their prices by 20% over the course of the pandemic. We are literally getting robbed and we are having more money taken from us to hold on to and to continue accessing the same resources that we need to live. And meanwhile that is happening, not only are these costing more, but the quality is degrading. I cannot tell you the amount of times that I've gone into Sainsbury's, I've picked up a pack of tomatoes, I've sliced open a tomato and it's rotten on the inside. Like, that did not happen 5 years ago. It did not happen 10 years ago. And those tomatoes are also just as expensive as ever. So I'm paying more to access shit quality goods. And then as a result, the funds that I actually want to spend on social spending, on traveling, on quality time with family and doing the things that I want to do, I have less and less of that left over at the end of each year. So even when you don't own any of the energy supply, or you don't own the house that you sleep in, you still have to use them whether you like it or not. Because currently those are essentials that you cannot go without, and you don't own them. And because our governments are in debt, and all of the resources that our governments used to own pre-Thatcherite era have all been given to private shareholders through suspicious contracts, they don't have any leverage to take that money back from the elite, or they don't have the wealth is so concentrated now in the hands of a select few people that the only way to be able to make things easier on ourselves is to get that money back. And again, Gary's Economics has done like quite a helpful video on this, like showcasing like the decline of government wealth over time and the increase in debt. Like, it's actually insane how little our governments own, and that used to be, as a general public, our safety net. So because they no longer have leverage, and they clearly don't seem to care about gaining any of that leverage back or actually doing anything in the public interest, we need to own the resources. We need to start increasing our ownership of the resources as a general public, and to be looking out for each other in order to protect ourselves from the fluctuations in the market, from the like destabilizing events that happen. So to me, the most accessible way that we do this is to buy shares. Until we have wealth taxes, which again, I want to do another video on that, until we have wealth taxes and until we have major policy changes, in the meantime, buying shares in a company is probably one of the most accessible forms of ownership that we have. When you buy into a fund for £10, you are not paying £10 to consume more oil or to consume more resources. You are putting that money into a company to work for you, so that when they make a profit, you get profit back proportionally to what you've put in. You're not consuming more of the product you're buying, you just own it. So over time, and when the market destabilizing events occur, the share prices of certain companies increase, and therefore your share in the company increases too. So although in the short term, you might be paying for more petrol in your kind of daily expenses, in the medium to long term, that company has to put money back in your pocket. It goes without saying that this is absolutely a privilege, to be able to pay for global conflicts with petrol prices and not with our lives. However, if you don't have any ownership of any of the resources, by investing, you are protecting yourself from getting robbed by these companies that view us as cogs in the machine, and that they think they deserve to exploit 99% of us globally who are just trying to survive and live in peace. So as a summary of this point, because I've covered a lot, I need you to think about investing as protecting yourself from getting robbed, and to decrease the impact of of these elites' attempts to exploit us. Capitalism is inherently an exploitative system that we live under that benefits the owning class. The shareholders own more shares in these companies than we can fathom, and their business profits are in fact our wages that we are forced to pay whether we like it or not. So each year that they take our money and invest it under their name, they rob us of more. So in investing a small amount each month and letting it compound over time, you are protecting your wealth by also benefiting from the increases in profits. My final point is all about intent. So the reason why our lives are only getting worse, despite having an abundance of resources, despite there being more resources on the planet, and despite us exploiting the earth more than we should be, is because the people that have hoarded our wealth in the first place not only believe that they're entitled to have it, but they would rather pay to avoid the inconvenience of basically interacting with the general public and having to face the consequences of their decisions. And they also have no idea how to be in a community in a way that doesn't rely on money. I was also, one of the things that I initially wrote when I was like writing out the script for this was the idea that rich people don't work hard. But I have seen multiple accounts of ultra wealthy people actually working extremely hard, but only for the sake of seeing the number in their bank accounts go up. And I wanted to highlight that because rich people that do have resources, could choose to have a life of ease with the resources that they have. They could not work at all, but and they could live a life that a lot of us would want to live, quite frankly. But the fact that some of them choose, despite having all of that access to the resources and being able to fund their own lifestyles with the money that they have, the fact that they choose almost a masochistic option of working themselves into the ground, of basically treating themselves like shit, I think is I think it's exemplary of the reason why we shouldn't have billionaires in the first place, because these people do not like themselves. I'm going to come back to the point that I was trying to make here. So what I want you to think about is basically what you would do if you have that kind of wealth, because the people that have this wealth right now, they are miserable. They fully buy into the doctrine of capitalism. They also very likely, fund the lifestyles of family members who buy into certain forms of social status or certain forms of patriarchy and things that basically make you miserable at the cost of keeping up with the Joneses. So I want you to think about the things that you would fund if you had that kind of wealth. In this moment, I don't want you to think about how you got it or what circumstances you would have to be born into, but I want you to think about what you would do if you had hundreds of millions of pounds. Let's say like 200 million pounds. So to give you a flavour, I would give a lot of the money back to organisations who could redistribute the wealth back to the people it was taken from. I would fund infrastructure in places vulnerable to climate disaster to prevent the forced displacement of millions of people. I would fund a global movement to tax wealth and not work, fund think tanks to help develop a framework for sustainably taxing wealth. And for myself, I would pay for a house for my brother. I would pay for some land and a house for myself. I basically want to live in a tiny castle with 3 bedrooms. So it's enough for myself and my partner to have access to working space as well, but also a 3rd room for a guest room. And I don't think that is actually too much to ask as well. I want the land to be able to grow crops and also feed people in my community with the excess that I create. I would use the money to fund my creative career. I'd love to do shows and just have a pay what you can model where people can pay what they like, but they don't have to pay for things that they can't afford. I want to be able to make my performances free for like vulnerable groups. I want to be able to fund organizations that are working on making the arts and making the performing arts more accessible to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to access them. I just want to like revive the creative movement in a way that doesn't rely on people exploiting themselves to be able to do it in the way that I'm basically currently exploiting myself now and using savings to basically fund my gap year. So matter of fact is, in a summary, is that I would do so much with that money. So let me ask you, who out of me or the billionaire would you prefer to have the resources? Because I'd imagine that unless you are a billionaire yourself, that you would probably pick me because you like what I would do there. So I need to start viewing money. So I need you to start viewing money as a means to amplify the things that you want to do and the things that you value, and to do that without the worry of financial scarcity. Just think about what resources you would exchange the money for, and what else you would do with and what else you would do with the time that it allowed you. Money is not the root of all evil, and the root of evil is the decisions that people make when they have money and what they choose to do with it. So by choosing to protect and increase your wealth, you are choosing to claim more power back and funnel that money into things that matter for you. And the impact of that today would be absolutely undeniable. So those are the 3 points that I wanted to cover today. This was a bit more money and finance heavy, but I've been thinking about this for ages. And I really feel like in sharing this, I'm also dissolving some of the limiting thoughts that keep cropping up for me and that I have to try and actively let go of whilst I'm on my journey to building wealth. There's certain things that I'm still not doing yet. I want to move some money from I've got like an emergency savings account, but like the interest rate that I wanted to put my money with Triodos, which is more sustainable. And on one hand, even though that is true, like for my emergency savings, like the yield on it is not great. So I actually want to, at the end of this year, once I've gotten the interest accrued and I've got it back this year, I'm going to put it into a better savings account. And then when it comes to investing, I'm still invested with Triodos and plan to continue to be invested in Triodos, even though they screen out things like oil and gas, they screen out arms, and they screen out other like harmful things like tobacco and stuff. But there are definitely several companies that are reliant on the fossil fuel industry that are in those funds, and I'm okay with that because at its core, it's the fossil fuel industry that is basically currently running the world right now. A lot of companies, I wrote down a list here. So if companies aren't directly extracting the oil themselves, they are using the energy supply for data centers, or they're buying the byproduct in plastic and then selling it to us as a new skincare trend. So even if you've screened out some companies, I still think investing something is better than doing nothing. So I'm kind of working on like wanting to rebalance like how much I've got invested within the larger companies versus the smaller companies and versus some of the more radical companies that are actually addressing the root cause of the climate crisis and doing things in a fundamentally more sustainable way. I want to protect my wealth, and I also want to be like, I want to mitigate the impacts that I will experience from the problem, but then I also want to be funding the solution as well. So I think for me, doing half and half, like, I feel like feels like a nice kind of in between. So thank you very much for listening to the Sovereign podcast. Please like and subscribe if this was useful to you, and do share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear where you are on your wealth journey, and if there's anything that you'd like me to discuss on this podcast. Thank you.